Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Classic Vinyl Podcast. I am Justin, one of your hosts, and I'm here with my other host, Tyler. How you doing today, Tyler?
All hail the great Pete Townsend. You pointed at him, that's why I said
That's true. I pointed at him on the wall, so I appreciate you letting me know that.
Yeah, it's an interesting night, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, so we've got an interesting album to do tonight. And
an album that needs no introduction because it's got plenty of introduction itself.
It does have plenty of introduction. And this one was sent in to us by someone who wants to remain anonymous, but they are from Tempe, Arizona. So, anonymous from Tempe, Arizona, we are going to review Moody Blues, Days of Future Past. Which I actually have a lot of history with this album, but what I mean with this album, it probably means Nights in White Satin.
Yeah.
My father had this album, which I actually own his copy of it now, and it's fallen apart. And according to him and my mother, that's because I used to build houses with the records when I was younger and draw on them a lot. And
a house of cards.
I did something. I'm not sure.
You'd use vinyl records, so this is like a monster house of cards.
My mother said I would build garages.
For your cars.
Yeah, exactly, with the records, which is what one does, right?
As one does, yeah.
So we are going to review the Moody Blues, Days of Future Past today, and let me give you a little history about the Moody Blues.
Mm-hmm.
So they are an English rock band. They were formed in Birmingham, of course, in England in 1964. Now, their original lineup was Graham Edge, who's the drummer, and the funny thing about him is he's been the only continuous member through the whole band's history until he passed in 2021.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Denny Lane originally was on guitars and vocals, and Denny Lane famously was in Wings with Paul McCartney. And, of course, on Days of Future Past, Denny Lane is no longer with the band. Mike Pinder on keyboards, pianos, and vocals. Ray Thomas on flutes, percussion, piano, and vocals. Klein Warwick on bass and vocals. That's the original lineup in 1964. Now, the Moody Blues are really hard to explain as far as listening to them, and especially this album, but, you know, looking at some of their earlier albums, some of their later albums, even into the 80s when they had some success, I mean, they had very psychedelic songs early on, a lot of rock, a lot of pop, a lot of symphonic sounds like we hear on this, a lot of progressive sounding songs. And they've influenced a lot of prog rock groups, you know, later on that got a lot from their sound. So the Moody Blues have had multiple lineups over the years. They've sold more than 70 million albums worldwide and a total of 18 platinum and gold records. As far as albums, they've released 16 studio albums, 8 live albums, 23 compilation albums. There again, more compilations than actual albums. And they've released 36 singles that hit the charts. As far as their albums are concerned, in the U.S., they had 12 albums in the top 40 and 6 hit the top 20. They did have 2 albums hit number 1 here in the U.S., which was Seventh Sojourn and Long Distance Voyager, which I've never heard either of those albums. In the U.K., they also had 12 albums in the top 40, but they had 8 in the top 20, and they actually had 3 albums in the U.K. reach number 1, On the Threshold of a Dream, A Question of Balance, Every Good Boy Deserves Favor. And, of course, favor with a O-U-R.
Yeah. It's always striking to me to see the comparison between how well they did on this side of the pond versus that side.
Yeah, and we don't get that with all bands, but most of these bands that come out of Britain in the 60s and stuff, yeah, it is kind of cool to see, just kind of see the difference of how they hit, because a lot of times these bands that come out of Britain do better in the U.S., funny enough.
So this band seems like it did equally well in both the UK and the United States. It was different albums that struck a chord, or different songs that struck a chord with the Americans versus the Brits.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, but this, you're right, these guys do, as far as sales and things, is pretty even up.
Yeah, but for different reasons, for different songs, different albums, right?
Yeah, kind of strange. They did have their first number 1 single in the UK was a song called Go Now. It was released in 1964. And that actually ended up being their only number 1 hit in the UK. But they did have 13 other singles that were in the top 100. Now, Nights in White Satin, that's off the album we're doing today, was their first number 1 in the US. But their song Question also hit number 1 in the US. They had 21 singles here in the US that were in the top 100. Like I was saying earlier, they did kind of have mild success in the 80s. They had Your Wildest Dreams and I Know You're Out There Somewhere, a couple popular songs from the 80s. and they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2018, which many people thought was kind of late because there was quite a few bands that were inducted before them. You know, we've talked about it before. I think the Moody Blues are another one of those bands. Even though you'll hear 2 or 3 of their songs still hit radio play, they're kind of a band that's, in a way, maybe not been shown their just due as time has went by. It's hard to say. I mean, I'm not a huge Moody Blues fan. I do like their hits, and like I said, I'm very familiar with this album as far as a couple singles off of it, but it's been a long time since I've sat down and listened to the album, and we'll get into that.
And once again, this is the first time I've listened to this whole album. I heard a couple of songs, but yeah, this is my first
Obviously,
time.
Tuesday Afternoon and Nights in White Satin are the 2 that you hear on the radio, and I don't think the other ones have ever been played on the radio, but...
No, they were new to me, all of them.
Yeah, so do you want to get to the album review?
Let's do it.
And now it's time for the album review.
Okay, Anonymous in Tempe, Arizona would like us to review Moody Blues, Days of Future Past. This is really one of the first times I've sat down and listened to this album as a whole, and like you just stated, it's pretty much the first time you listen to the album as a whole.
Oh yeah, I've heard radio play of Tuesday Afternoon, Nights in White Satin. I used to play frequently. It's got a dear place in my heart. We'll talk about that when we get to the song.
So Days of Future Past is the second studio album released by the Moody Blues. It was released in November of 1967 by Dream Records in the UK, and it wasn't released until March of 1968 in the US, so it was quite delayed here, and I'm not sure why. It was recorded at Decca Studios in West Hampstead, London, in England. It was produced by Tony Clark, who had produced the Four Tops, Blue Jays, Nicky Hopkins, Justin Hayward's solo career, one of the main singers on this album. So let me give you the lineup of the Moody Blues on this album. You have Justin Hayward on vocals, guitars, and piano, John Lodge on bass and vocals, Mike Pinder on the mellotron, piano, gong, and vocals, Ray Thomas on flutes, percussion, piano, vocals, Graham Edge on drums, percussion, and vocals. And then, of course, overwhelmingly taken over on this album by the London Festival Orchestra with Peter Knight conducting.
I'll say it is.
And you will notice when I said Justin Hayward on guitars, there's very, very few guitars in this album.
Yeah, he sat most of it down, I think, except for he sang quite a bit.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of piano. But I think that the Mike Pinder, well, boy, does he shine in this one. He even gets the final word. He plays that gong that ends out the whole album.
Yes, he does. So this album is really considered to be one of the earliest examples of progressive rock. I don't know if I really consider it that way. This is so orchestra-driven that, I mean, a couple of songs, I guess, are progressive. I think more the theory of the album is progressive than anything.
This feels like a concept album.
Yeah. And I think it really is, because you've got the orchestration mixed with somewhat of rock and roll. There's very little in this, but it's explaining the day from morning to night of an average man, right?
Sure.
And going through everything. It's almost a rock opera type of thing, just without the rock.
Yeah, exactly. It's very much an evening at the symphony we've just spent.
There are some exceptions to that.
But there are a few exceptions.
Yeah, and a lot of people consider this album to be very psychedelic sounding and pop and rock. I don't really catch much psychedelia in it.
Just one song, really, is psychedelic.
And it's kind of questionable, too, as far as I'm concerned.
I think it was pretty in my face. But we'll also point out that.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
So this album reached number 3 in the U.S., but only number 27 in the U.K., which, you know, and I wonder if part of that had to do with it was such a late release in the U.S. that, you know, some of its steam had already picked up, and
that could be.
They had released Nights in White Satin as a single, and so...
And also, what were they up against in the U.K.?
Yeah, well, they released it at the same time, basically the same time as... Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band had been released, and so just a couple months later, so kind of interesting. But they did have 2 singles off the album, Nights in White Satin, which reached number 1 in the U.S., number 9 in the U.K., and then they had Tuesday Afternoon, which reached number 24 in the U.S., and number 12 in Canada. Probably the only 2 songs we hear off this album being played, and they still are played on classic rock radio to this day.
They're the 2 songs on the album that are classic rock.
Yeah, basically. Little tidbit about this album is the second and final album to be released in the U.S. in both stereo and mono. And I guess the mono copy of the vinyl is pretty rare. So if you get a chance to find one of those, pick it up. It's worth some money. And this album was not originally well liked by the critics. It was kind of a far departure from rock music, and we'll certainly get into that, but it has received acclaim since then, and I think that is due in certain areas of it and maybe not so much in others.
This is a lot like playing Barney's sing-along favorites to Simon Cowell. That's not really his cup of tea.
Yeah, so as far as the album, it was certified platinum by the RIAA in the USA, and it actually wasn't released on CD for the first time until its 50th anniversary in 2017. And it obviously had a bunch of alternate versions and things like that. And I have not heard that version of it. So the cover is kind of interesting. It was designed by a guy named David Anstey. The band spoke to David apparently in a pub and told them about their songs and what they were doing with the orchestra. And he basically knocked out the album cover picture pretty quick after that. And it's a really surreal.
The album cover is very psychedelic.
That's what I was going to say. The most psychedelic thing on the album is the album cover, and it's kind of interesting. It's got all these different little photos and colors flowing around, and
it's essentially like a 4-quadrant of the 4 seasons kind of picture.
But I think it's supposed to be the 4 sections of your day, right?
Yeah, and it like blends together a whole bunch of different things, like the phases of the moon are in there. And, some different typical things that you would see in a park, like trees, rocks.
It's really kind of hard to explain. So if you want to see the album cover, go Google it because it's interesting. And one thing about the album cover is they were actually different in the UK and the US, basically on the top. And where they released the album later in the US, they actually put a little box at the top right-hand corner stating that this album includes Nights in White Satin, because at the time Nights in White Satin had become a hit. And so...
we know what you guys like.
Yeah, so they were basically the same album covers, just had a little bit different on the top. Do you want to get to the album?
Yep, let's spin it.
Side 1.
Okay, so side 1, song 1, it begins with a song called The Day Begins.
The Day Begins. That's a cute name for it.
This song is broken down in 2 sections. The Day Begins, which that section was written by Peter Knight, and it's completely instrumental. And then Morning Glory, which was written by Graham Edge, which is basically instrumental with some spoken word to it.
Yeah, some like poetry.
Yeah, and
beatnik poetry.
Yeah, and I had written that it's sang by Mike Pinder, but it's not sang by Mike Pinder. He just simply speaks,
he does the recitation.
Yeah, and it's basically an overture to the album, with a poetry ending at the end of it. And the poetry, if you have heard Nights in White Satin, kind of resembles that because it does start with Cold Hearted Orb that rules the night. Kind of goes into that whole thing like at the end of Nights in White Satin, but it has a little bit, some different verses to it. And this song, all in all, is about 6 minutes in length.
That sounds like the poetry in this sounds a lot like something that you'd get out of Alice in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass.
It's kind of strange. Now, I'd like to know what you think of this. I think this is actually a good opening to the album. I like the way they put this as the overture on the album. I like the way the poetry spoken kind of kicks you back to Nights in White Satin.
And it plays out like an overture. You hear different parts of the songs that you're going to hear throughout the album.
Exactly.
As part of it. So it really is an overture. This is an evening at the symphony, this album.
Well, yeah. And for me, the first note I wrote, you got the orchestral beginning, and to me, it feels like an old-time movie or a Disney movie or something.
Yeah, but the very opening is some sort of reverberation. It's like some sort of droning or humming or buzzing, and then it opens up to the orchestra and the symphony.
Yeah, and I think it's a good way to open the album. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'd say that for looking at this as a concept album, saying, look, we're going to try and mesh 2 very different styles of music together, symphony, classical symphony, and rock and roll. Does this say it? I don't know. I like the concept, but this is a very good overture for the album.
I think the overture is good. I think if that's what they were going for, to mesh rock and roll with orchestra, I don't think they did a very good job of it.
No, it sounds more like
with the exception of a couple songs.
It sounds more like something that they would do off of a Dare.
Yeah, it's kind of strange. And, I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself, but I think the second side of the album is much stronger than the first.
Oh, absolutely.
And yeah, the first album or the first song on the album is a good opening. You know, it kind of tells you what you're going to get.
It is not rock and roll.
There's no rock and roll. There's no. You're not hearing any drums. You're not hearing any bass or guitar or anything like that. So it is, like you said, right on the head. It's a night at the symphony.
Mm-hmm. And it's very much like instrumental. There's hardly any lyric at all. The poetry's at the very end. So for the most part, this overture feels like you're going to have Cecil B. DeMille reading the poetry.
Yeah, it's kind of strange in that way. So that moves us on to the second song, which is Dawn. Dawn is a Feeling. Now, this song was written by Mike Pinder, and it's sang by Justin Hayward and Mike Pinder. This is, I guess the one thing about this song is it's a departure from standard Moody Blues tunes, is generally they would have the songwriter sing the vocal, but they didn't on this one. You know, it was written by Mike Pinder and obviously sang by Justin Hayward. This is supposedly an uplifting anthem celebrating the feeling of power and a new start, especially to your day. For me, I'm going to go right into it. This is just another continuation of the orchestra, and I don't have anything against orchestration, but it's not used well in this as far as a mix with rock and roll. This is just straight orchestration.
It is. It's straight orchestra, straight instruments, and symphony. Yeah, I've got next to several of these first opening songs rock and roll ?
Yeah, and I mean it's got some good imagery in the lyrics. You know, there's
good strings opening. It's your stereotypical, you know, beginning of the day classical.
Yeah, and I do like Justin Hayward singing, and I don't know if that's because he's the main vocalist on Nights in White Satin, and the song I've been most familiar with. So I do enjoy his voice, you know. And the lyrics, you know, have a lot of imagery to them, you know, like this day will last 1,000 years if you want it to. I mean, this is the beginning of the day. You've got a barely audible bass in this, some piano, but this is pretty much straight orchestration, and this really isn't it for me.
No, but this is the kind of song that it's got the beat, the message. What this has is it tells you what you want to hear on your way into the office, where you're just looking for a really good day to come your way, and you're going to crush the crap out of it or hit all the sales bro goals that you've got. Or, you know, it's a very upbeat. Inspirational is not the word that I'm looking for. That's what it's trying to be, I think, is inspiring to start your day off well, on the right foot.
Well, and I'm no symphonic expert, if that's a word, but I guess they do a good job of putting that together, and I don't mind listening to it, but for me, I guess the thing that's kind of tough for me is when I sit down to listen to what's supposedly be a rock and roll or a pop record or something. I don't mind hearing this as the overture. I don't mind hearing it mixed in well. And this is not a mixed song. This is straight symphony.
Yeah, it is. It's straight symphony. There's no rock and roll in this.
Yeah. So let's move on to the next one. So now we go from dawn to morning. The morning, another morning.
Yeah, we've switched from the strings to a flute.
Yes, we have. So this one's written and sang by Ray Thomas, and it's describing kids playing. You know, they're out playing first thing in the morning, but it's basically from the eyes of the adult narrator, right? And talks about time standing still for children forever, because you remember when you were a kid how everything lasted forever. Don't you remember how long the summers were and how long the days were, and you would just play and have a great time? Now, you say flute, but I know this Mike Pinder plays the mellotron on here, so I think maybe that intro is actually a mellotron and not a flute, but it does sound like a flute.
But then it's also got that like accordion thing that gives it kind of that jaunty rhythm that makes it sound like you're coming down from the Alps.
So what are your thoughts on this song?
Another evening at the symphony. One thing I did like, I like the line, yesterday's dreams are tomorrow's sighs. I thought that was a very poetic thing. And I didn't get a lot of the poetry in this album. So for that line, it just seemed like really good illustration that yesterday's dreams are tomorrow's sighs.
I thought, you know, as far as this being the third song on the album, it does kind of have a marching sound on the intro in the orchestration. This song, and you'll hear me say this again, but Ray Thomas singing this, he really reminds me of, he sounds like Arthur Lee from Love. And this song has a section in it that sounds like a love song. And I did write on here as my notes, this is the first real vocals on the album when we're on to song 3. And they're okay. They're not great.
Yeah.
I thought it sounded like a love song, but it wasn't as good as a love song. It was okay, but once again, Night at the Symphony, a little too much for me on this song and not a good enough mix.
I like the vocals on the band members. I think it's a really good concept to have whoever wrote the song sing the vocals. And this band, I think that they're fairly competent vocal artists.
Well, yeah, they have more than...
They can sing pretty well.
Yeah, they have more than one lead vocal. I mean, all these guys could sing. Like I said, I really like Justin Hayward. I just like the tone in his voice and things. But yeah, most of them that sing can sing well.
Yeah.
And I do like the spoken word as well. I mean, it sounds good, you know?
Yeah.
It's just, this is another symphonic song and definitely not my favorite. But that moves us on to song 4, Lunch Break. Peak Hour.
The Hustle Bustle song.
Yeah, there you go. So this one was written and sang by John Lodge. Now, the intro is played by Peter Knight and the London Festival Orchestra, once again. This one does have a little bit of rock and roll sound into it. About halfway through the song, it kicks into it.
Finally.
Yes, but it does have some more Graham Edge poetry in it as well. And I wrote some notes on this one, but let me hear what you think of it first.
I've got some notes on this one. I enjoyed this song. It was a cornucopia of sounds is what I've written down here in my notes. This is a very busy song. There's a lot going on, a lot of different instruments. And then it goes to the second half, and I have to wonder, is this the same song? Because it sounds entirely different. And that's where we get, for the very first time on this album, a rock and roll.
Yeah, it's the last, I mean, it's only song 4, but it is the last song on side 1. And halfway through the song, it does kick into a rock song.
And it sounds like the Beatles.
It's got a decent bass line in it. It's got a decent keyboard and organ in the song. The drums aren't bad. And I even heard a little bit of guitar in the breakdown at the end. And so this song was not bad. I did think that John Lodge, I think out of all the vocalists, I think he's probably the weakest vocalist on this.
I could agree with that.
But it was good to hear because when I first started, one of my first notes was more symphonic sounds, you know, more movie music. It kind of sounds like background movie music or something, you know. It just seemed like another carry-on. It has good imagery in the lyrics, once again, because we're explaining the day and things like that. But I did appreciate the second half of the song. I probably would have preferred hearing Justin Hayward or Mike Pender sing on it, but it was a good departure that we finally, when we get to the last song on side 1, we get a little rock and roll.
Yeah, it only took him until the second half of the last song on the first side.
Yeah, but you're right. It wasn't a good mix either. It's not like they mixed symphony with rock and roll. It went from that orchestration straight to a rock and roll song like it was a 2-part song.
Yeah, it really felt like a 2-part song.
Yeah, very interesting. So do you want to get to side 2 of the album?
Let's flip it over.
Side 2.
Okay, so side 2, we're finally to the afternoon midday. And this is another song that's made up of 2 pieces. Forever Afternoon is what it was called, and it was written and sang by Justin Hayward, but the single was actually known as Tuesday Afternoon, and that's the single you would know if you've heard it on the radio. And then the second part was called Evening, Time to Get Away, and that one was written and sang by John Lodge. So you've got this one song, The Afternoon, by 2 pieces. This one's almost 8 minutes in length total, and obviously the single was referred to as Tuesday Afternoon. Sometimes you hear just the first part, sometimes the radio plays all of it. I enjoy this song.
Tuesday Afternoon.
I think he did better than you.
He did.
So this single was written by Justin Hayward. Apparently he spent a Tuesday afternoon in a park in England, and these are the lyrics that came to him. So there's been quite a few cover versions of this song, which this is the first song on the album that you actually could cover because it's the first real song. What are your thoughts on this?
I had to look up where Waipiat Park in England is. That's the park. It's just a little bit south of Gloucester, northwest of London. But I wrote down, this song finally fits the mixing of symphony with rock and roll. So this is the first song on the album where I find what they're trying to do gets pulled off decently well. And it for being a 2-part song, it fits decently together. The parts mesh well. It's easy listening. I enjoyed it. It was nice on the ears.
Yeah, this has got a good recognizable intro if you've heard any classic rock radio in the last 30 years. Once again, I love the vocal because I really have kind of pulled towards Justin Hayward's vocals. It's got good imagery in the lyrics. He did a good job with that. It's got a good bass line, which I really like.
Yes,
and it's pretty much the first one you've heard. There was a sample of a bass line in an earlier song, but this is the first one with a good rock and roll bass line. The drums are a little tinny and far away sounding, but they're okay because it's good to hear them. And there's still not much guitar in this song, though, because you've got the good mix of symphony. But I do like the way they integrate the orchestration into this with the rock and roll. This is done perfectly. And I know I said on the previous song, Lunch Break, that I don't really care for John Lodge's singing, but he sings the second part of this song, Evening, Time to Get Away, and I really actually like it in that. It's got a good vocal, a good feeling. I just like the whole song, and it's even got a tiny bit of guitar at the end. It's just, this was a perfect example of what I think this whole album could have and should have been, in my opinion, because you've only got really 2 songs that did this and did it well, and they're the 2 songs we still hear to this day. And
the symphony really dominates this whole album.
Especially side 1.
Yeah.
I think the way they use it in this, though, is perfect because you're showcasing rock and roll and you're showcasing the symphonic side of things. And it's such a good mix because you don't just get, at least for me, I don't get washed up in thinking, this is like some kind of Disney movie thing going on. And that's what it feels like. Oh, and there's some spoken word.
No, it's a nice mesh of rock and roll with the classical instruments.
Yeah, it is. So that moves us to the next song. Now we're all the way to Evening.
And if you've been waiting for percussion, here it is.
So Evening is another song that's broken down in 2 sections written by 2 different artists. So the first section is The Sunset, and that was written and sang by Mike Pinder. And the second is Twilight Time. It's written and sang by Ray Thomas. A lot of people consider this the most psychedelic song on the album. I don't really see it that way. It doesn't seem psychedelic to me, and I don't know if that's because the orchestration really just overpowers that, and I don't see orchestration as being psychedelic. This song runs a little over 6 minutes in length. What are your thoughts on this one?
This is the one song where, well, first of all, my first thought is, like I said, if you've been waiting for percussion and you wanted to hear drums, this is the song where you're going to hear it. Because it's got like this Middle Eastern or African feeling to it with the kind of drums that they're playing. Very heavy percussion in the first half.
And it's funny you wrote Middle Eastern African because I wrote this is an Indian feeling song. Yeah. And it did seem that way to me, as kind of had that Indian music feeling.
It's definitely got some sort of like Asian African influence. This is, like I said, this is the song that is psychedelic, if there is a psychedelic song on here, because I see where normal singing ends up drowning into this weird noise. And that's the psychedelics for me, is that the second half, that Twilight Time, is where you get the strong psychedelics. And let's see, he says what? Night is coming and it's going to get weird if you're on acid, is the feeling that I get. It's a weird song, and it's a song I don't want to be high or tripping on acid while I'm listening to it.
Yeah, well, I mean,
it'll give me nightmares.
This is, of course, back to heavy orchestration, and the vocal kicks in with Mike Pinder, and it's kind of an echoey vocal, and that's when you get kind of the Indian feeling. Then you hear all those bongos and percussions and whatever they are, and maybe that's what give it the Indian feeling. I know a lot of people have explained this as psychedelic, as you just did. I don't really find it that way. Maybe that's just because of the orchestration and the Indian-inspired music I'm hearing in that. Once again, though, on the second half of the song, Twilight Time, when Ray Thomas sings, even more so in this song, he sounds exactly like Arthur Lee from Love. And the second half of the song sounds just like it could be a love song to me. And it's not too bad. I don't care for the first part of the song, but I like the second half. And the second half has got some decent bass in it. I really like the bass line in it, but once again, pretty void of any kind of guitar or rock and roll. But the second half of the song was pretty decent, and I didn't mind it. Yeah, I didn't mind it at all.
Yeah, the second half sounds like a psychedelic rock song to me.
Yeah.
Even if you don't hear the psychedelics.
Yeah, I don't really hear the psychedelics, but I guess if I was to pick one that's the most psychedelic on the album, then I guess I would pick this, but because nothing else even comes close. So that moves us on to the last song on the album, which is another two-parter, and this is, broken down. This is called The Night. So you've got the first part, which is Nights in White Satin, which is written and sang by Justin Hayward.
I always thought it was Knights with a K.
No.
Like knights wearing a white satin cape over their armor. But
no, this is like knights. Like
the
nighttime.
Yeah, the nighttime.
Yeah, and then the second part of the song is called Late Lament, Resolvement, and that was a poetry section written by Graham Edge and Peter Knight, but it's spoken by Mike Pinder. And Mike Pinder's the one that speaks the same section on the opening song of the album that kind of echoes this. Now, this song is almost 7 minutes in combined lengths with the two sections, and most of the times nowadays when you hear the single on the radio, you hear the second section and everything. So they play the whole thing. It was originally issued as a single in 1967. It reached number 19 in the UK originally and 103 in the US. That's when it was first released. But it was re-released in 1972, and it actually reached number 2 on the Billboard charts, number 1 in Canada, and number 9 in the UK.
Did really well.
The single versions were actually stripped originally of the late lament sections like I was talking earlier, but most of the time when you hear it nowadays, it has that on there. Now, Justin Hayward wrote this song when he was about 19. Pretty simple. It was about a girlfriend that gave him satin bed sheets as a gift. So that's how he came up with the song titles. So
satin sheets feel nice.
They do. The single is certified gold in the U.S. by the RIAA, and it's been covered by a number of people. Nancy Sinatra, Devo, a ton of others have covered it in different ways. What are your thoughts on this song?
I think someone's carrying a torch for the one that got away. Yeah, this is a great song. Like I said, this was a revelation to me about the Knights, but I also have very fond memories of this song. I used to play it at work in order to get a coworker to go when he wouldn't leave because he hated Moody Blues.
Did he hate the Moody Blues or just this song in particular?
This song in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was this song in particular. And I don't know why, because it's a decent song. It's a great song. It's my favorite on the album.
Well, it's my favorite Moody Blues song by far.
I thought it was a really good recap of the introduction and the overture at the end. And then it ends the whole album off with that gong blast. So I'm like, yes, this is what I've been looking for this whole album. I really enjoyed the song.
Well, once again, kind of like Tuesday Afternoon, they hit it with this one on the perfect mix of orchestra and rock and roll.
Yeah, exactly.
And this isn't even so much rock and roll. I mean, you do get a really good bass line. That's the thing that stands out in this thing to me all the way through. I love the bass line.
But it's not like overcome by the symphony. It incorporates the symphony.
It's perfect. And I love the Justin Hayward vocal on it. Once again, the lyrics have imagery that's amazing. Just what you want to be, you'll be in the end. This song I have a lot of history with, so my dad this is one he used to play for me all the time. It's still on the radio. I'm sure this is the most played Moody Blues song on the radio to this day still.
Absolutely.
As it deserves to be.
Yeah, because, satin sheets, you'll slip right out of the bed if you roll over.
You will.
This song is a cautionary tale.
Not to fall out of bed.
Yeah.
So, in the middle, I like when it kind of breaks down. They've got like a kind of a flute solo, but the bass is still very good and prominent at the time. I just love it. I love how they go into, yes, I love you, how I love you, yes, I love you. I love the way they sing that. And then it slows back down and goes back into the orchestration, and then it gets into the late lament portion where Mike Pinder does the spoken, bedsetter people sit back and lament another day's useless energy spent, on that whole section that, like you said, echoes back to the overture, kind of has some of the same words there. It's the same voice. You can hear it. And it, the funny thing is when I say some of the music sounds movie-like, Mike Pinder's spoken word is kind of a movie type of voice. He's a voice meant for radio and meant for movie or something. I think he does an excellent job at that. I love this song, and I think, like I said, this one and Tuesday Afternoon are put together really well. Probably what the rest of the album should have been, in my opinion, if they could have done a better job of mixing rock and roll. It is what it is.
And Mike Pinder is the British Cecil B. DeMille.
Yes, he is. So do you want to get to winners and losers?
I think so.
Winners and losers.
Okay, Ty.
Oh boy. This was a tough one to do, ratings and winners and losers, I gotta say.
This was a tough one to take notes on.
It was, because it's so much instrumental. So I'm going with losers. Evening would be my least favorite. And I don't even know if I can break it up between first half and second half. Probably the first half, the sunset. It wasn't my gig. It wasn't my sound. My second loser, going all the way back to the second song on the album, Dawn is a Feeling. It just didn't really inspire a lot of notes from me. Not a terrible song, just not rock and roll at all, for sure. So those are my two least favorites. What about you? What are your two least favorites?
So we're pretty close to the same. Song 2, Dawn is a Feeling. That one and the next one, The Morning, Another Morning, those two are my least favorite.
You just hate the flute opening.
I just don't. It's just too much orchestration for me.
Yeah.
And they didn't integrate it well. And I don't have anything against orchestration, but we're listening to a rock and roll album here that's supposed to be mixed, and they did that well with a couple songs, and the rest are just orchestration, and I just don't think it works. I really don't like side 1 hardly at all. I could do without anything on that side.
I'm sure that side 2 would get the most play.
Yeah. So what about your favorites? What are your two favorites on the album?
I would bet $50 that you and I are spot on with our favorites. Going with The Afternoon and Nights in White Satin.
There you go.
Yep.
You don't even need to call on me, because Nights in White Satin is my favorite Moody Blues song, without a doubt. But those two songs on this album, like we've said a couple times, they did those right. That's what this whole album should have been.
Absolutely. And, especially if they're doing like a concept album, if they're trying to showcase the melting together of the psychedelic rock with symphony and classical instruments, those two songs you need more of that.
Yeah, it's an interesting take. I just don't really care for the album past that. The overture is good because it gives a good opening, and I think that's kind of a fitting thing because it echoes to how the album's going to end and things, but all the songs in between really don't do a whole lot for me.
Seems like it needs to be the soundtrack for a movie or a rock opera.
Really does. You want to get to an album rating?
Yep, let's rate it.
Album rating.
Okay, Tyler, so you've listened to the Moody Blues Days of Future Past for the first time. You knew 2 of the 7 songs.
The 2 good ones.
The 2 good ones. So what do you give this album as an album rating?
I'm going to apologize to Anonymous from Tempe, Arizona. But at the same time, I do want to thank you for giving us this recommendation, because I did enjoy listening to it, and I enjoyed getting an interesting introduction to something very different than we normally do on this podcast. But even so, I'm going to have to give this album a less than 5. I'm giving it a 4, because I think that 2 songs out of 7 just isn't enough to carry this whole album. What are your thoughts, Justin? Where do you put this one?
Well, I'm over here still putting pen to paper trying to decide on my
Well, you decide on that. I'm going to explain our rating system for anybody that's a first-time listener. 0 is the worst, and if it's a 0, we're going to break the record and get rid of it. If it's a 10, and that's as high as we go, then I have to buy the album. So, 5, it's right there in the middle, and for me, a 4, this is just under right in the middle.
I think this one's a tough one, because you got 7 songs on the album. 2 of them are pretty strong. Very strong. I put them on any playlist I have, and I really like it. But I don't think I can give this album as an album any higher than a 4.5.
Yeah. You give me 7 songs on this album that are on par with Tuesday Afternoon and Nights in White Satin, and this album gets a 9 easily. Maybe even a 10 from me.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see that, but I just think they missed the mark with most of them.
As is, can't do it.
But there's a reason those 2 songs are still playing on the classic rock radio today, because they are excellent songs. And I'd rate Nights in White Satin probably a 10 out of 10 as a song.
Yeah.
And I would give Tuesday Afternoon a good 8 out of 10 as a song. So, I really enjoy those songs, but this album for me misses the mark on what it should be, And I don't have anything against orchestration or symphony. It's just the way it's used here doesn't seem to really fit for me. It's this concept album, it really misses the point with me.
Whoever is out there that has the ability, make this into a rock opera. I want to see the rock opera.
Well, we already know who's done the best rock operas ever.
Mm-hmm.
And they did 2 of them, and they're excellent.
Yes, they are.
And that is The Who, and we're going to get to them shortly. But that is the Moody Blues. That is Days of Future Past. If you have a problem with the way we rated it, or you think something different, send us an email. Send us any suggestions, comments, complaints to classicvinylpodcast@gmail.com. Reach out to us on Instagram. Reach out to us on Twitter. We're not afraid to take complaints. We've gotten them before. So
So Tempe, go ahead and send us an email following up, and tell us where we're wrong or tell us if we're right.
But until next time, we'll see you later.
See ya.
Thank you so much for listening to Classic Vinyl Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow us on Instagram at Classic Vinyl Podcast for updates, and also share us with your music-loving friends.